Welcome back, everybody. Today we are ranking the Final Fantasy mainline games, and this is a fun video, something that I've wanted to do for a long time, and something that I will be doing for other series in the future, but Final Fantasy gets to be the first one because I recently finished 15, had a great time with that game, and 16 happens to be around the corner, so there's no better time to talk about Final Fantasy than right now. A couple things that I want to say about this video. First of all, it's going to be split into two parts. Instead of just doing the plain rankings and going from worst to best, I also thought of something a little more interesting, and that is going to be an awards section. So, for example, I can talk about something like the music and announce a winner for the best music in the Final Fantasy series, and that allows me to, one, highlight some other games that might not be towards the top of my list, and two, spend some time talking about other aspects of the games and not have to bring it up for each individual game. Might save a little bit of time that way. Now, before I get into that first awards section, I just want to mention a few things. I am not going to be talking about Final Fantasy 11 and 14. I've never really counted them with the online games because not everyone's even going to have access to them necessarily. They're such odd outliers that I always thought they were a little unusual. And I am going to be including a couple of spin-offs, mostly because I didn't realize that they were spin-offs until the making of this video, and they are 10-2, 13-2, and Lightning Returns Final Fantasy 13. So the 10 duology and the 13 trilogy. A couple more things. I am going to be mentioning what hardware I play on. I think that's important because when I give my opinions on Final Fantasy VI, for example, it's going to be important to know that I experienced that game on the Game Boy Advance. And a lot of you may have played it on the SNES, and maybe that's why we'll agree, maybe that's why we'll disagree. Probably disagree. And then I also played these games mostly in chronological order. I can't remember where I slotted in Final Fantasy III. I think it may have been after the advanced line of games, but the rest of the series, and maybe 3 itself, was also played in chronological order. That's something that I'm always really particular about with any series that I play. So yeah, just worth mentioning. Anyways, let's finally get into the awards section now. To start it out, we have the best party. And that award goes to Final Fantasy IV. So, Final Fantasy IV, in other words, has some of the best characters overall. And it's worth stressing that word overall, because some of my favorite characters are in other titles, but Final Fantasy IV just doesn't really have a weak cast, you know? I think a cast is really defined by its weakest members, and they kind of pull the whole thing down. Final Fantasy IV is strong all throughout. They're all memorable. They all have their moments to shine. And maybe I'm being influenced a little bit by the after years because those characters get some more spotlight. I'm trying to keep that bias aside or that influence outside. Final Fantasy V is also great. I like that you can just be the protagonist in that game, and then the party members you surround yourself are also very enjoyable and fun to experience the adventure with. It's a small, tidy party, but I thought it was a little more fair to give it to 4 because I do remember them being a little more fleshed out. And the nice thing about 4 is they all have their place in the world. They don't just exist simply for the sake of the story and simply for the sake of your protagonist. They all belong in that world. They all have other duties, families, responsibility, whatever it is. So, Final Fantasy IV, best party. Next up, best protagonist, and this goes to Final Fantasy II. I just really like Furion's design. Amano's art is beautiful for all of the games, but Furion, his unique design, bright and colorful, doesn't have a lot of the obnoxious belts like Squall. I really like him as a character too, even though he's got tons of memes about him. He's a little more serious and a little more likable than the memes would have you believe. Lightning, I also really enjoy her character, but Furion, for whatever reason, ever since I played Final Fantasy II, I just really enjoyed his character. I liked playing as him. I liked the way he interacts with everybody in that game. And there was even a time where I just used Furion avatars for all these online profiles. So yeah, it's a funny pick, but there you go. Next up, somewhat similar, the best antagonist. So we're still talking about characters here. And this goes to Final Fantasy VIII. I've talked before about how I think Kefka is completely overrated, and I considered giving this to Sephiroth because he's a presence from the very beginning of the game. That's really important in Final Fantasy VII. But in Final Fantasy VIII, it's specifically Cypher. He's genuinely annoying. You really do feel like there's a rivalry between him and yourself. He's probably the best foil in the series to the main protagonist that I can think of anyways. And I just love how every time he made an appearance, he did something that just made you hate him even more. You wanted revenge against him, or you wanted to one-up him, whatever it was at that particular point in the story. Cypher, pretty darn good character. Never hear him talked about though. This is a pretty special award, the best story. And before I actually announce the winner, I just want to say I have a bit of a problem with Final Fantasy stories in general. They're all flawed in some way. They all have their inconsistencies, they all have their weak points, or they introduce plot twists that just kind of disrupt the rhythm of the main story and the storytelling. Just a plot twist that comes out of nowhere, but instead of it seamlessly fitting in and being believable, it's just a little too far out there. They're really reaching with them. So, with that in mind, I'm giving this award to Final Fantasy 15. And I've talked before about how it's flawed, I know, but I just thought from beginning to end, what they wanted to tell was a pretty tidy story. And yes, the love story aspect of it could have been executed a lot better, but it was enjoyable. And I've got to give some points to how much I enjoyed the story, so Final Fantasy 15, and of course, like with all these categories, Final Fantasy 7 was in consideration, and a couple of other games. Best humor, and this is going to Final Fantasy 9. This is something that I just thought of when I was replaying Final Fantasy 9 for this video, and it just struck me that all the jokes they were telling, they all fit. And it's something that has to do with the world in that game. You know not to take it too seriously. It's kind of like made by a Japanese Dr. Seuss or something, right? With all the different characters that are there and the antics of the characters. Yes, there's certainly an overarching serious story, but so much of it is comical. When you actually play the game and interact with the characters, there's opportunities for legitimate jokes, and not the kind of stuff that's rammed over our heads in modern day storytelling. So Final Fantasy IX, sure, some of the jokes are immature, but some of them are clever, and like I said, the world really allows for it. So worth playing Final Fantasy IX if you want something a little more lighthearted. This category is pretty special to me, the best world, and this is going to Final Fantasy XII. Now, like before, when I talked about Final Fantasy IV and not wanting any bias with the characters, I'm trying not to be biased when it comes to Ivalice because I've played the tactics games and I've loved them. They also take place in Ivalice, in case you haven't played those. But Final Fantasy XII, on its own, does an outstanding job. First of all, just with the imagination involved, a lot of the points that I mentioned for Final Fantasy IX, they also apply here. But what's even better about 12 is it feels like it's an independently run world, separate from you, the character. And let me just talk about this a little bit more. When you play Final Fantasy XII and you're exploring the markets and the other parts of the city, you really do feel like a small fish in a big pond. Whatever you do or whatever exists there is not crafted specifically for you, the player. You are simply there by happenstance as another ordinary citizen or extraordinary citizen, but everything there is for you to interact with the same way that anyone else would. It's a massive, sprawling world, and even though it's not made with today's technology where you could have things happen while you're not playing the game, for example, first you might learn that this lady is looking for her dog or something. You turn the game off, you turn it on again, and it turns out that somebody in the world helped her find her dog. Those kinds of things aren't happening in Final Fantasy XII. The technology wasn't there yet, but you still get the sense that there are events going on that do not involve you, and I love that. The last category here, the final award, is for Best Music, and I was torn. Before I announce the winner, let me just mention some honorable mentions, because there are games that have potentially better individual tracks. Actually, they absolutely have better individual tracks, but they did not win for the overall soundtrack. So those are Final Fantasy II. If you play Final Fantasy II, just the first 20 minutes or the first 40 minutes, pretty much every single track of music that you listen to is going to be outstanding. It falls off a little bit afterwards. Final Fantasy VI, I've mentioned before, Terra's theme is incredible. Final Fantasy VII, I like probably a handful of tracks there. There's the one with Vincent, I think it's called The Nightmare's Beginning. I've played that so many times back when I was in high school. I loved it. I was hooked on it for whatever reason, even though it's a bit of a melancholic sound. There's Genova, which is probably my favorite song in the whole series. I like one of the battle themes, Aerith's theme or Aeris's theme, Tifa's theme. So yeah, Final Fantasy VII is probably the runner-up for this one. Final Fantasy IX, I've mentioned Over Those Hills. It's got a couple of titles, but that's the one that I use. And Final Fantasy XV, I just highlighted a song, but I'll talk about Final Fantasy XV again upcoming. So, the winner is Final Fantasy I, specifically for the NES. I love the sound chip there, better than the advanced sounds. And let me just go through a few of these here. First of all, you all know that the iconic title theme, prelude, and victory theme have been used and reused all throughout the series. This game has established a lot of mainstay songs and motifs. Next, these are the S tier tracks that you owe it to yourself to just go listen to these on YouTube with the NES versions, don't forget. The town theme, the defeat theme, the shop theme, and Matoya's Cave. Those are great, and then I also happen to enjoy, but you don't have to listen to these, the Overworld, the Castle theme, Temple of Fiends, and the main menu theme. So that was the awards section. Of course, if you want to go and talk about your favorites, whatever has the best music or the best characters, you can do that in the comments. Doesn't have to be a competition, but I'm just curious to hear what your answers would be. Alright, here I go now with ranking the games, and hopefully it doesn't get confusing when I mention what rank they actually belong to. So, rank 17, this is a surprise because it is a spin-off, The After Years. I'm playing the Steam version, and really I'm just mentioning this game to advise everyone to skip this, or at least skip this version. I think it could be better with the NES or SNES style graphics. The Steam version, I believe, is a port of the mobile version, but what they did when they ported it is they eliminated the possibility of using the touchscreen. So I'm playing this on my Steam Deck, which does support touch, and yet I can't do that because it's not included in the Steam version. Now aside from that, it's just really slow, it's really clunky. It uses those 3D DS models that are just abhorrent. They should be left behind on the DS console, they should not be brought back. It's a terribly slow game, even if it does add a little bit of flavor and a little bit of extra content for the characters. In my opinion, it's just not worth playing. So a terrible honorable mention, and no game actually wants the honor of being dead last on this list, but there it is. Next, in 16th place, we have another spin-off, Lightning Returns. Sorry guys, I'm mixing in the spin-offs of the mainline type games, but whatever. This is just a terribly boring game with a combat system that I despised. Now, I have spoken to a couple people and they actually like the game. There's something wrong with them, alright? No, I'm kidding. You can like the game, there's nothing wrong with that, there's nothing wrong with you. I just really didn't like it. It strayed so far from Final Fantasy, but I get it now, okay? It is the third entry that is a spin-off in this trilogy. But it's a terrible way to conclude the game story-wise as well. The things that they did with the characters were really disappointing. So, Lightning Returns, I'm not going to spend my time bashing games at the bottom of the list. I'm just going to say, oof, awful. Next, the first real mainline game to appear on this list, at the 15th position, is Final Fantasy III for the Nintendo DS. And I just finished complaining about the DS models, but that's not a complaint I have with this game. Look, this is just the best that they could do when the game was released. I don't hold it against them. One thing I do hold against them though, and I just realized this when I was replaying the game, they do not make use of the dual screens. For most of the game, I believe you could say it's like 95% of the game, you are only looking at the bottom screen and the top screen's blacked out. So that's just a really bad oversight in the game development, I guess. It can be a fun game when it's just not absolutely crushing you with its overpowered monsters, because there is a nice job system implemented. It's more the Bravely Default style, where the more you progress, the more you unlock, but it didn't hook me. It didn't hook me like Final Fantasy V, which has a lot of similarities, and after I beat Final Fantasy III, I never thought of it again. So this is probably the least memorable, the most forgettable game in the whole franchise. In the 14th position, we have Final Fantasy XIII. I play this on Steam. First of all, I remember when I booted it up, I thought, wow, these are amazing graphics. And I really like Lightning. She's a likable protagonist, but the rest of the party leaves a lot to be desired. Snow, the problem with these party members is they are all so clearly written to have their pros and their cons. They all have such strong personalities, and all those personalities have their flaws. I don't know why they couldn't be a little more nuanced, and Lightning herself, even though she's got a lot of dialogue, she is more of the silent protagonist archetype. Whatever. I remember with 13, it really didn't feel like a Final Fantasy game when I played it, and I was waiting to experience things like chocobos, or even if I had something like fire or thunder, it still didn't really feel like Final Fantasy, and that's mostly due to how the combat system is. Combat and the way spells and your attacks are implemented, people do praise it for having a more complex combat system and that there's a lot you can do as far as customizing it and having variety in your battles. I didn't feel it. It all boils down to, at the end of the day, use your stronger attacks. Oh, the enemy's going to do something? Well, you react to it. I mean, yeah, and you can boil down a lot of games that way, but I just want to say that when people praise Final Fantasy XIII for doing something different, I say don't really listen to them. A lot of those differences just fall flat. Give me traditional Final Fantasy gameplay, please and thank you. Next, in the 13th position, we have Final Fantasy X-2, and this is for the PlayStation 2. Worth mentioning a little story right here. I remember a long time ago, a bunch of us friends were gathered at one person's house, and somebody brought along his copy of Final Fantasy X-2. And I remember that cover art because it appealed to every adolescent boy's fantasies right there. You have Yuna, you have Riku, and then you have, Pain. Okay, I clearly don't like Pain, but again, some of you might like her. Not a knock against you. But still, they give us two great characters, and then that's the third one. That's the filler who they fill the party out with. Anyway, this game is pure fan service, for better or for worse. That did not hook me for very long, because once the annoying tendencies of the game start cropping up, you just want to rid yourself of the game. I wanted to wash my hands of this thing so quickly. Not because I was doing anything dirty with it, but because it was such a dirty, terrible game. It's worth highlighting the combat because they do some interesting things with it. I do like the sphere grid, or the dress sphere, whatever. I'm getting them mixed up in the different games. It is the dress sphere, and you can change your class mid-battle. That's really cool. You can do that for all three of your characters, so there's a lot of possibilities there, but it's not enough to pull you through the whole game. The main antagonists, who are meant for, I don't know, comedic relief, they were just ridiculous. The game could have been so much better without them. And if this game had a cast of characters that was completely unrelated to Final Fantasy X, it would probably be below Final Fantasy XIII for me. Maybe it would even be below Final Fantasy III. I don't know. In the 12th position, I'm sorry, I'm going to be upsetting some people with this, I put Final Fantasy IX for the PlayStation 1. Look, I gave its praises before. This game does a lot of things really well, and I personally believe that if I could pick one game to encapsulate the whole Final Fantasy series, one game that best represents a little bit of everything that the series has to offer, it would be Final Fantasy IX, because it has a lot of the classic themes, it has the classic gameplay with a nice little unique twist on it, but I don't like the jobs, I don't like the characters, and when I say the jobs, it's worth noting that I know you're not changing jobs of your characters, otherwise I would like it a lot more. Your characters are fixed to certain classes that are unnamed, but you know what they are, right? Like Zidane is a thief, Steiner's a knight, a magic knight, etc. So yeah, I didn't like its characters, I especially did not like its dungeons. The story was fine, but it didn't really do anything for me. And I just wish there could have been a little more customization with the characters. We just came off of 8, which was really heavy with customization. 7 even had a little bit more with materia. Quite honestly, I don't remember a lot of Final Fantasy IX, but hey, it's not at the bottom on my list, it's somewhere around the bottom middle. In the 11th position, we have Final Fantasy VI for the Game Boy Advance. So apparently, I'm still not done annoying people and getting people angry, because I'm taking two beloved titles in this series, and I'm putting them at 11 and 12. I'm sorry, but the games just did not appeal to me like some of the others in this series. 6, I will give it credit, because it's a good blend of humor, drama, storytelling, and gameplay, but it never exceeded my expectations in any of those areas. Again, we had just come off of Final Fantasy V, which did a lot of those things really well, and did combat exceptionally well. So what did Final Fantasy VI do? Instead, it gave me a bloated cast. I felt it was really unnecessary, especially when it's at the end of the game, you're chasing down a few more party members. We didn't need them. It has some of the most annoying dungeons. These things were just absolutely miserable. I remember one in particular where you have to split your party up into 3, and I didn't mind that we had to use different party members than who would have been in my main party, because I'm somebody who rotates through my party members regularly. I like to use everybody, level everyone up equally, all that kind of stuff. I just didn't really feel drawn to the party. I didn't like the dungeon layout, and I have more complaints about the game, but it doesn't deserve to be berated. Final Fantasy VI, when I was replaying it, I could understand a lot of the love for the game. Certainly has a lot of charm, but it's just not my favorite. Now advancing to the top 10, and in the 10th position, we have Final Fantasy IV, also played on the Game Boy Advance. And this game, I feel, is super similar to Final Fantasy VI. I'm giving it the edge here, like I mentioned before, for its cast of characters. I like the story a little bit more, even though I like Terra in Final Fantasy VI, and I like Locke and a few of the other characters there. Again, Final Fantasy IV is a cast of characters that I just can't really complain about from top to bottom. One thing that Final Fantasy IV did, which was really memorable, and this is in complete contrast and opposition to Final Fantasy VI, is it had a great final dungeon. There's something that happens in the game, and I remember when I was experiencing that, I thought it was so cool. And when the game rewarded you with another party member, at that point, it felt fitting, it felt special, and it was so exciting. It got me really hyped heading into those final battles. So Final Fantasy IV gets the edge over Final Fantasy VI, but they're both pretty good games. Now, in the 9th position, this is the last spin-off to appear on this list. Again, I'm sorry for having spin-offs, but I'm just repeating myself at this point. Final Fantasy 13-2. Played this on Steam, and what does this game do better than, God, 4 and 6, and certainly better than 13? Well, speaking of 13 specifically, it improves on the combat. Final Fantasy 13-2 is really interesting in that it kind of takes 13's combat and it adds the twist from 10-2 with the dress spheres. But instead of having your characters play dress up and including these Japanese idols, instead you have a monster filling out the 3rd slot of your party, and you can change that monster out to different monsters who you have in your ensemble, but only 3 can join you per battle, and you have 1 at a time on screen. And that is how you cover a lot of elemental weaknesses or strengths. If you want to play a little more defensive or offensive or play with some buffs, that is where variety is included in 13-2. It's also worth noting that the story and everything about this game was heavily simplified, especially compared to 13, and quite honestly, I preferred that. 13 got a little bit bloated with the storytelling and different missions that it had you go through. 13-2 is just about the combat and the quests are pretty fun because they make use of a really interesting time travel mechanic, and you get to visit different locations of the game in the past, in the present, in the future. Can't remember if it's all 3, but it's at least at 2 different states in time. So, Final Fantasy 13-2. If you've gone ahead and you've played 13 and you're thinking, I didn't really like it, I kind of feel like dropping the trilogy now, do yourself a favor, try out 13-2, just don't advance to the final part with Lightning Returns. Now, top 8. These are the really special games on my list. And at the 8th position, we have Final Fantasy I, both Dawn of Souls and NES, but primarily Dawn of Souls. I have to mention the NES because that is what I played when I was a kid. I grew up playing that game with my brother. I was really silly when I played it, and I would name my party members after my family members, and I had fun giving them different classes. And I remember anytime any of them would get wiped out, of course it would upset me because I just watched someone in my family get slain by a monster. But yeah, great time, tons of nostalgia there, a lot of good memories. But I'm not putting it this high just because of nostalgia. Like I said, the Dawn of Souls version really cleans it up, really makes it a fun to play modern game. Kind of helps that I had the strategy guide to go with this game, and so I could find a lot of the secrets and I could navigate the dungeons more easily. But I also had a lot of the gameplay knowledge baked into me from when I was a kid. I remembered at least the start. And this is funny. I thought, and I've mentioned this before, I really believed that the tutorial boss, Garland, was basically the last boss of the game, or one of the last characters. Look, I was 2 years old when I started playing this game. And so I would get to Garland, and I'd be really happy that, yeah, we managed to beat him. You can beat him without even fighting any other combat in the game. So when I was replaying it, I finally beat Garland, and I went back to the castle, and I advanced, and then you had a little miniature credits roll. It was like an introduction to the whole rest of the game. There was a little closing section to tell you that, hey, that's it, the prologue is over, and now Chapter 1 truly begins. I couldn't remember ever seeing that when I was a kid. That had really good music in it too, though. So Final Fantasy I, I could keep on talking about its nostalgic elements and the memories that I cherish, but I'll just wrap it up by saying that it's a very good game, super classic Final Fantasy. Obviously, this is where it all began, and this is one that's worth playing just to see how it started. You're gonna like the simplicity of it, and it gives you everything you want in a JRPG. Now that that's out of the way, we can move on to some beefier games. And in the 7th position is the appropriately ranked Final Fantasy VII for the PlayStation 1. Now, shock, I know, Final Fantasy VII so low on the list. How is this not number 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever? Look, I just don't feel myself getting carried away by the zeitgeist that adores this game so much. I think that because this game is a cultural phenomenon, people get into it with really high expectations, and they probably adore the characters a little more than they should, even though it doesn't have a lot of personal, sentimental value for them necessarily. They go and they experience what everyone else is talking about. I did that. I tried that. I really like the characters. I do. But maybe because I didn't grow up with a PlayStation 1, that's where there's a little detachment from this game. Still, a really good game, does a lot of things well. I already mentioned how much I like the music in the game. The characters are good. but that's pretty much it. It's a good game, and it does a few things really well. I wasn't blown away by the materia system whatsoever. Combat coming down to just 3 characters in your party on screen, that also kind of killed a lot of my excitement for the game. But still, I enjoyed playing it, and I would replay the game. Probably before that, though, I got to play Final Fantasy VII Reborn. Alright, moving on now to the top 6. And I wish that top 6 was a thing, because with top 5, I have to leave one of these great games out of my list. But here we are at number 6, Final Fantasy XII for the PlayStation 2. I did not play the Zodiac Age. This is a game that at first was surprising me for the worst, and then the more I played it, surprised me for the better. Vaughn is not necessarily the most likable protagonist, but he's a little more mature than your typical bratty teenager. Yes, he gets his nose into a lot of affairs that probably he has no business sticking his nose into, but hey, whatever, that's the way the game is written. It's nothing that's so offensive or so hard to believe. So Final Fantasy XII is a well-written game, it's a competent story that's being told, and I just love the world so much. And I like the way that the party interacts. Maybe individually these characters are a little more bland than the ones that appear in other titles, but you do get the sense that there's a lot of camaraderie here, that they do get along, they all want each other's best interests or have each other's best interests at heart. I typically like political stories, so I like a lot of the warring between the kingdoms here, and that's something that always happens in Evil East, like Final Fantasy Tactics, you're going to get a lot of the same stuff, so that's here in Final Fantasy XII. And I also should mention just the general feel of the game. It feels a little more like an MMO. It's basically a single-player MMO at times. People have criticized the battle, the combat, for not feeling like Final Fantasy. Oh, they got so far away from turn-based. No, not at all. It can be different from turn-based, it can be more action, but really it's just like the ATB system, except your character can move around on the map. And of course, something that I have to highlight in this game is the way that you customize your characters and you upgrade them. You have this massive board, a license board, and the more you play the game, the more you do these different things and slay monsters, you get points, and that helps you upgrade your character, unlock different things, customize them how you will. I love the little drawings, I love how you can see what every item looks like. There's just so much that's brought to life with this game, and the hunts as well. You know, I love hunts, I love these types of side quests. Even if I didn't engage in all of them, I like that they're there. The bounty system is so cool, should be in so many more games. At number 5, Final Fantasy X for the PlayStation 2. And this, like 12, is another game that grew on me the more I played it. Going into it, I was familiar with Tidus's laughing scene, the big meme online. I'd laughed along with some of them. There's one where his laughter is edited into the Big Bang Theory instead of the typical laugh track. And so yeah, I was already having fun with the characters and poking fun at them a little bit before I played. And certainly the beginning can be a little off-putting. Tidus's character is that of a spoiled brat, but he grows on you. The way that he narrates different parts of the game is really cool because it shows this Tidus that after looking back on his journey, he had grown, he had matured a little bit, so you can appreciate that part of his character. And like I just mentioned with Final Fantasy XII, this game has a really fun board to level up your characters with. The more you battle, the more points you get, and then you don't get points in this game, you get these little items instead of points, but it's essentially the same thing. And with these little items, you're going to be spending them on the board, and once again, that is how you're leveling up and customizing your characters. So Tidus doesn't have to be a warrior or whatever. He can dip into the thief pool a little bit, he can dip into one of the mages pool, but of course all the characters start out in different areas of this sphere grid, so they do have these standard paths or these default paths that they can follow, but hey, if you want to, go ahead and deviate, go do something different, make the game your own. I do want to mention a detractor of this game was the linearity of the maps, and especially that of the overworld. So the overworld has just been dispensed with for the most part. When they get to traveling between different towns, it takes you to just this map screen, and you see your characters moving as a dotted line on the screen that you don't control. That was pretty lame when I first experienced that. And the maps themselves, there's different corners and different nooks that you can explore, but you see the full highlighted shape of the map with all of its restricted areas. It's a little unusual. It makes it feel like it's more closed off than it should be. And the story, I may as well mention, for as engaging as it is, and that's probably the best thing that I could say about the story is highly engaging. There are just as many confusing moments as there are mysterious moments. So when I finished the game, I still didn't really know what the heck had happened. And I remember having to look up different things and read about it and watch some videos on it. Even now, it still doesn't really make sense to me. That's kind of the weakness of the story and the weakness of the writing. But hey, it's a small criticism for a game that's really fun to play. In the fourth position, Final Fantasy VIII for the PlayStation 1. And this gets the honor of having the best minigame in the whole series. Triple Triad, easily the most fun minigame that I've played in Final Fantasy. I love my card games. I've dipped into them a little bit with The Witcher. Witcher had Gwent, for those of you who didn't play it, and I like that one there. I like this one here. I appreciate the fact that they tried to write a more serious love story in this game, even though it is incredibly overrated by this game's fans. Like, it's not a love story that's going to blow you away. The time that Squall spends with his love interest isn't going to make you think, oh yeah, they are perfect together. No, but there are some cute scenes between them and some cute interactions between them. So that was good. The thing that Final Fantasy VIII does so different from every other game in the series is the combat and the way that you get stronger. Now, there's something that I just want to focus on first, and that is how you equip yourself with different elemental infusions and different ways of powering up your attacks or your stats. That's really cool because that's a lot of good customization. You can basically think of it as like a twist on the materia system, but you have more slots to make use of. You equip your magic as little power-ups instead of materia. And magic in this system is also really unique. When you go into battle, your characters have the option of drawing from an enemy, and that draw ability does exactly that. It draws magic out of the enemy, and you can either store it and have charges of that spell, or you can simply return it to the enemy if you don't have the magic ability equipped. Magic ability lets you use any of your stored magic. If you don't have it, then you can only use what's been drawn at that turn. There's more that I can say about this system when it comes to junctioning, which is just its fancy word of equipping your spirits or your summons. I forget what they're even called in this game. Your GFs, which I'm still not even sure what that stands for. It takes a lot of the things that you're familiar with from Final Fantasy and from the whole franchise, and it just does something a little different. It puts a little twist on it, but the way that it all comes together was really enjoyable for me, at least. So Final Fantasy VIII, fantastic game. Even if it doesn't start very strong, the more you play, the more you get involved with the intricacies of the combat system, and I think the more you'll enjoy it. But I realize this game is not for everybody. Now, these are the really precious games in the Final Fantasy series, my top 3. I do want to mention, though, that the third place game is a little bit of an odd one. There's definitely a clear difference between 1 and 2, and then the games that follow. But that said, game number 3 is one that I really enjoyed, Final Fantasy 15. And if you want my full thoughts on this one, I highly recommend you go watch my review of it. I did it right after beating the game. I think I uploaded it about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So go watch that, it's still definitely relevant. What I will add on to it now is that Final Fantasy 15 is probably my biggest surprise of the series. This is a game that I had only heard criticism before going into it. People mocked and ridiculed the main characters, the way that they look like this emo boy band, and I get it. They definitely do come off that way. There's a lot of stuff that I don't really care for in the way that the game is cheesy, the way the characters interact with each other, and a lot of the jokes. But eventually it grows on you, and eventually you feel like one of the boys as you play the game. I mentioned before the story is pretty good, certainly flawed. No story in Final Fantasy is not flawed, but in 15 it's pretty good. And the combat is not as boring as people might make it sound. And even though it's action, even though it's completely different than what we're accustomed to in Final Fantasy. So I guess all of that is just to say that there's a lot of differences in the combat especially, and that's where the game most feels different. But in all other aspects, in the different parts of the world, and as you explore it, you certainly are going to feel like you are in a Final Fantasy world. So Final Fantasy 15, once again, go check out my review. I hope you'll want to play the game after you watch that. Hopefully you'll want to play the game after seeing it here at number 3. I've got my number 1 fan here as I talk about my 2 favorite games in the series. And really, ever since I put both of these games down, the feeling has been the same for both of them. And these are easily interchangeable at my top 2 positions. Number 2, though, I'm going to say is Final Fantasy II. And again, I played this as the Dawn of Souls on the Game Boy Advance. Final Fantasy II is easily the most criminally underrated game in the whole series. I don't understand where a lot of the hate comes from unless people played versions that are not Dawn of Souls. Dawn of Souls runs really smoothly and has a really fun system in place for combat and for leveling up. This stat system is one of my favorites in any RPG, even if most of it is superficial or cosmetic. The way it works is that you can equip any character with virtually anything, and the more they use that particular thing, for example, if I equip Furion with an axe, even if he has proficiency with swords, he will gradually become proficient with axes as well. If I want to, I can dual wield with Furion. I can make him have a staff and a javelin, or whatever it is. I can give him a bow. And as long as I keep on grinding with him in battle, he's eventually going to become proficient and an expert in that field. So that kind of thing is more in line with my idea of an immersive RPG. That is how I start to feel like I'm a part of the adventure. That's how I feel like I'm really enjoying the game, if I can customize things to my will. And it's not so far out there because these characters do have their own particular molds. They have their own personalities, they have their own names. But the fact that I can go in there and detail them when it comes to combat, which is my favorite thing to play around with in Final Fantasy, I love that. For example, with 13, with 9, I just mentioned how I don't like that the characters are fixed in their combat roles. So being able to change that in 2, fantastic. Also worth mentioning that the other aspects of this game are good or great. The story, the characters, all of it pulls you in, all of it helps you appreciate what's going on. You feel invested in the story, you like talking to the different characters, you like how you can engage people in different topics when it comes to conversations, learning about things, inquiring about other topics. There's a lot to like in this game. Once again, I can't believe that it's so hated by so many people. I think if any of you feel wronged by this game, maybe you didn't play the Dawn of Souls version, if you can, find a way to play Final Fantasy II Dawn of Souls, and I'm pretty sure this game will climb its ranks in your books as well. Finally, in the highly coveted #1 position, we have Final Fantasy V. Like I said, easily interchangeable with 2. Both of these are my favorite games in the series. I'm giving it to 5 just for more memorable moments in the game, maybe more that I can actually remember from the adventure. And yes, I play this on the Advance as well. The only game that I played on its original hardware in the early 2D era was Final Fantasy I. So, Final Fantasy V really picked me up after I had a little bit of a dip in the series. I mentioned that I liked 4, but it just didn't do enough for me, and I thought, oh boy, where are we going? I've still got so many games to go before I get to Final Fantasy VII. That's what I was really working my way towards. And then I play 5, and you get to play as the protagonist, which is great. The other characters you encounter are okay, but there's good bits of humor in the story that really keep you going. The characters who you meet and filling out your party all happens fairly quickly, and the combat and the way that you get to change your jobs in this game and you're unlocking different jobs, the fact that it gives you a lot from the very beginning so you always feel like you have more to do and more to level up and more to grind. I like grinding when it's done well with a good, practical, and fun to play combat system. That is the case in Final Fantasy V. I wish I could say more about the story and other aspects of this game, but quite honestly, I can't remember a lot of my time through the game so many years ago. But one thing that has never left me is the feeling of how much I loved the game. And again, most of that is due to combat, but Final Fantasy V, Final Fantasy II, these are games that when I put them down, I just knew that, okay, I finished some top tier games. I don't want to say masterpieces, because quite honestly, these are not 10 out of 10 games, but they're right up there. They're 9 out of 10 games. Final Fantasy for me, not to rag on the series when I'm trying to highlight it and celebrate it in this video, but Final Fantasy has never had any masterpiece games for me. Games that I certainly adore, games that I certainly praise and talk about and want to replay, but like Pokemon, they're just consistently good. They're never consistently excellent. The few excellent games that there are though, here they are. 2, 5, 12, take your pick, whatever it is for you. So I think that's it. Hopefully you all enjoyed watching this. I enjoyed making it. I didn't really know what I would say about the individual games. I just knew how I was going to rank them when I started making this video. And Final Fantasy, like I said, it's a series that's been with me since I was 2 years old. I kid you not. I've told the story on my channel before, but I was 2 years old, and I have a memory of turning 3 and being really upset that a couple of buffoons overrode the save file that my brother and I had on the NES. That's a story that I'll repeat some point in the future. If you guys want more of this kind of content, it will be coming with Zelda, with Pokemon, in due time. Final Fantasy, I just wanted to get this one done after 15. And go ahead, talk about your favorite games, your favorite moments in the comments. I'm going to be looking forward to reading those, and I will see you all in the next video. Thanks for watching.